Hey everyone. Here I am in traffic, and I suppose this is a little bit of a behind the scenes video. I'm driving to the campus, to the University of Melbourne Parkville campus right now. It is 7 a.m. I've already been on the road, believe it or not, for about an hour and a half. I live a long way away. And it's day one of lectures. It's Tuesday, the 3rd of March, 2020. And today we're going to have our first Mind, Brain and Behavior 1 lecture, or lectures. And of course there'll be a construction of work that's put in by all of us. I'll be speaking, but you guys will be there listening in person, in the Overflow Theatre, online, and it's something that we're going to create together. In fact, all of the Mind, Brain and Behavior 1 course is something we create together. It's something I like to think of as a social construction. And I'm just so excited about what is in store for you this semester. We've put so much work into refreshing Mind, Brain and Behavior 1 for this year. Almost every single thing in the course is new and improved, and I can't wait for you guys to experience it. And my goodness, I hope the audio on this recording is working, or I'm really wasting my time. So as you'll see in the lectures today, there's a certain sequence of topics in the subject, starting with learning and cognition, which is actually how I got interested in psychology, through learning, and specifically how marine mammals learned. My first career was not in human psychology, but in animal psychology. I spent 10 years, or a little over 10 years, as a marine mammal trainer before I came to study psychology. And in particular, seals. Seals were my thing. And I still have colleagues in the marine mammal and tiger training industries, and colleagues at the zoo. And in fact, I've got a video that I'll share with you shortly that will help contextualize some of your learning and cognition coursework around classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and we'll have a look at that together. It's a video I shot last year where I went along to the zoo, the Melbourne Zoo, and visited some colleagues in the marine mammal department, and we looked at applying the learning theory and principles that Meredith McCaig will teach you in the start of the course to the conditioning of marine mammals, seals in this case. So I find learning to be a fascinating subject. And of course, so many of you would have heard about things like Pavlovian or classical learning before, classical conditioning. And the basic idea here is that some neutral stimulus, something in our world that it could be a sound, it could be a thing in your environment, it could be a time of day, it could be, oh gosh, so many things. A dress somebody's wearing, something that is reasonably neutral beforehand, when it is observed in concurrently with a stimulus that naturally elicits a response, something we'd call an unconditioned stimulus. So maybe something that makes you fearful, for example. That neutral stimulus, typically through repeated pairing, but if it's something that makes you really fearful, it's a threat to your life, it might happen in one instance. That neutral stimulus can take on the power of the unconditioned stimulus, whatever that event was that was quite, for example, if it was fearful, a fear-provoking event, an anxiety-provoking event, it could be a range of things. Maybe it's even talk of the coronavirus, right, on the news. In fact, there would be a fair bit of classical conditioning going on around coronavirus right now, which would be eliciting fear and anxiety responses in people. So the basic idea is that this previously neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus, something that can naturally elicit a reaction, a response, which we'd call the unconditioned response, and then that neutral stimulus takes on the power to be able to do the same, to elicit a response from you, because it's been paired, it's been associated with that unconditioned stimulus, either once, if it was a very powerful type of pairing, and we call those types of pairing one-trial conditioning, and generally, again, can happen around things that are meaningfully related to a threat to life or to wellness. For example, food aversions are one way in which we can experience one-trial conditioning. When I was very young, probably about your age right now, and I would like to think a far sillier version than I am now, I may have one night had an encounter with black sambuca, which is a very strong alcohol that's got an aniseed licorice flavor, and perhaps too much of it was consumed, and perhaps I was not very well. And to this day, over 20 years later, I cannot handle the smell of licorice, and certainly even just thinking about black sambuca right now is making me feel uneasy and a bit queasy. And that's a good example of one-trial conditioning. Previously to that night, that dreaded, fateful night, black sambuca held no meaning for me. It was a neutral stimulus. I'd never tried it. But experiencing it in close temporal proximity, so at the same time, the same situation as being physically sick, that was all that was needed. That one trial pairing of the black sambuca and the being sick, and that was one trial conditioning. The black sambuca label, bottle, just reflecting on all the things that come to mind. The smell of licorice, It all acquired that power of the unconditioned stimulus to elicit that conditioned response. So when I think about licorice right now, I get a bit queasy. That's a conditioned response that's happening in correspondence to the conditioned stimulus of the black sambuca. Whoever thought that I would be using this as an example for teaching, but there you go. And I had no intention of drilling down into classical conditioning, and we haven't really, but there is an example of classical conditioning as we go over the Westgate Bridge. So I was going to be telling you about the sequence of events in the course, wasn't I? So we've got learning and cognition, about learning and about how we think, about how memory works and so forth. We have then got sensation and perception, which is another really fascinating area of psychology, and it's about how our senses, so vision and smell and taste and hearing and other senses that we have, tactile senses and so forth, how these take in sensory information from the environment around us and make use of it and create the experience of perception that you're having at any given point in time. And perception and consciousness are just such a fascinating area of psychology. How it is that this experience you're having right now of listening to me while you're sitting somewhere, you're aware of what's going on around you, you are experiencing consciousness, you're experiencing the world around you and your inner world. How that comes out of your brain, which is biological, right? Cells, a big group of cells in your head. How we get this experience out of biology, we don't know how that happens yet. We can certainly make inferences about aspects of sensation and perception and consciousness by looking at experimental psychology, which is very much what Mind, Brain and Behavior 1 is about, experimental psychology, and looking at what evidence we can draw from experimental psychology to tell us about, for example, what region of the brain is implicated in processing sound information to help us with hearing, or processing visual information to help us with vision, and so forth. But that harder question of how qualia, the phenomenological experience of existing comes to be, that's of consciousness, that's a more difficult question, and certainly one that psychology has not answered yet. So who knows? Maybe you're going to be the person to work it out. And the last section of the course is about behavioral neuroscience, and very much what we were talking about there, the biology, the structure and the function of the human nervous system, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, but very much a focus on the brain. And we've done a lot of work to present a very interesting and engaging section here that's very accessible for people that don't have any science background previously. Lots of people get anxious about the science component of psychology, but we have put a lot of work into making it accessible for everybody. So I think and I hope that everybody's going to find all aspects of of mind-brain behavior 1, which ultimately are all scientific, to be very accessible and enjoyable and enriching and challenging and challenging you to learn new things and to look at the world and yourself in new ways as you start to understand how your brain and how your mind works. And you might not have even thought about the distinction between the brain and the mind before. When we talk about the brain, we're talking about the biological organ in your head, right? But when we talk about the mind, then we're talking about an abstract concept that doesn't tangibly exist. It's one of those constructs that we were talking about. And when I say when we were talking about, it's something I talk about, I think, in my first or second research methods module. And research methods is the other component of the subject that you will learn about. You'll learn how to conduct psychological research, and you'll also get to participate in psychological research. I think psychological research is fascinating, and again, because of the intangible nature of the things that we are actually interested in psychological research. The fact that these things don't physically exist, I think, just presents a very alluring challenge for the thinking mind, to think about how can we interrogate, how can we investigate something that does not physically exist, like happiness, which is a construct, an abstract concept that we theorize underlies things like smiling or laughing behavior, or a range of other things. How can we actually measure that validly and reliably? I think that's a really fascinating problem. And it's one of the things that you'll learn during this subject. It's one of the things that our psychology graduates are most valued for by employers as well. Their ability to think critically about evidence. And a part of psychological research methods training is training around critical thinking. How to think about evidence and the quality of evidence and how that evidence was generated, and whether evidence that's being used to support various claims that are made, whether it's in politics or in science or any avenue of life, how that all holds up. And to really evaluate that evidence, you need to be trained about psychological research methods. And we are going to do some experiments this semester. They're going to be fascinating. I know what they are. And you're going to have a lot of fun. Of course, on the tip of your tongue is that question: are we going to mess with people's minds in this psychology subject? And of course we're going to mess with people's minds. We have a particularly fun experiment that you will participate in that's going to do exactly just that. And I think, just generally speaking, the content this semester is going to mess with your mind and even from the start, when you start to consider things like your memory and how memory actually works, and that your memory is maybe not as reliable as you thought it might be. And the fact that it's possible to do things like implanting false memories in a laboratory setting quite easily. So these are all things that we have ahead. And I was just speaking to a friend in Seattle, and we were talking about the coronavirus situation. He's a pilot, and a commercial pilot for a major airline, and of course the coronavirus situation has had implications for the airline, and just like the airline, coronavirus of course has got implications for what we are doing in the University of Melbourne and in Mind, Brain and Behaviour 1, and obviously particularly for the students who are affected by the travel ban implemented by the Australian government. And certainly our thoughts are with you and your family, your families, as you're going through this very difficult time. And for everybody else who is here on campus, as time ticks on, I think it's safe to say that, we will need to, each one of us individually, probably be precautionary about the way in which we get around our daily lives in Melbourne as winter comes, and we'll probably just need to be mindful about all of those sorts of things that one does to try and avoid getting the flu, right, during winter. And this will be especially the case for us this year. So, I went to Coles last night and I saw that Coles is a supermarket here in Australia. I saw that hand sanitizer was sold out. And we're seeing, I think the media is really fueling a fear response about coronavirus. My personal approach, I suppose, at this point in time, based on the evidence that's available, is that I'm not alarmed. I'm aware, and am taking and will take, as winter comes on, those typical precautions that I take every year to avoid getting the flu. Obviously, getting a flu shot is number one, although it's not going to cover coronavirus, right? Until later in the year when they've developed the vaccine. But hand sanitizer and so forth, just being clean and hygienic, and if you want to wear a mask, you can wear a mask and so forth. And the university is already, I think, sending out some communications around guidelines for avoiding, picking up any flu, really. And if you live in a city, you know this game. You've done this every year. Anywhere where there's lots of people, you've got heightened risk of flu transmission. This is just public health 101. So I don't think there's any cause for alarm. Certainly we'll follow the university's advice. But for now, we're all good to go for launching the semester, and not having to worry, not having to panic, right? Sun's coming up here in Melbourne. I'm in the CBD now. So it's only a few hours until I give a lecture, and the very first lecture for Mind, Brain and Behaviour 1. Not even a few hours, it's like 2.5 hours. And I've still got some bits to put in it, believe it or not. So it's mostly done. There's just a couple of other slides I want to put in. want to put in something that is hopefully inspiring to people and interesting for people, and just speaks to something that I think is fascinating about psychology, that encapsulates a lot of what's going on in Mind, Brain, Behavior 1 in terms of content. And so I have an idea. I just need to find a good graphic for it. I do a lot of research around clinical psychology, and in particular severe mental illness like schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. We would say psychosis means not really being in touch with an agreed upon reality, having a different experience of reality to that which is generally experienced by others. And my PhD actually was on the experience of hearing voices in schizophrenia. And so when I say hearing voices, I'm talking about hearing voices that aren't objectively there. Auditory hallucinations, we'd say auditory verbal hallucinations if we're talking about voices specifically. So the reason this really fits with Mind, Brain, and Behavior 1 is that my PhD looked at what we would say in big terms were the cognitive and neurobiological substrates of hearing voices. So in other words, what it was about specific elements of cognition, of thinking, and of sensory processing as well, and perceptual processing, and what it was about the structure and the function of the auditory processing cortex, the auditory cortex in the brain, that may have been related to the experience of hearing voices in schizophrenia. And so let's say I run with this. In fact, now that I've said this, I'm going to run with it. There is a graphic that I have, I just need to find it, which shows an MRI study of people hearing voices, and shows the auditory cortex lighting up in an MRI and activating during the experience of hearing voices, and that is giving us some neurobiological evidence that corroborates this experience of hearing voices, and highlights that, unlike some people may think, this is not just imagination. The auditory cortex is activating just as it would if you were experiencing a sound, which is really interesting, right? And so I'll draw out a story here about cognition, sensation, perception, and neurobiology, and highlight why I thought these things were interesting. In fact, I thought those topic areas were all so interesting, and clinical psychology as well, that I needed to build them all into my PhD. I wasn't happy to leave one piece out of the picture, and that's the way I went. And I'm just so excited for you all. You're going to have a great year, because you're going to, in first year psychology, encounter so many things that are just so interesting to you. It's like a degustation menu of interesting things to learn and to think about, and the knowledge that you'll have at the end of this year, the end of this semester, if you only do one semester with us, is just going to be, I think, really something that you look back on and you might even be a little bit amazed about all of the things that you've learned. So I might do a few more of these behind the scenes videos. I will have a better audio setup for future ones. This was very much an impromptu decision to do this. I figured that all I needed to do was talk, and that was pretty easy to do while I was driving, just like talking on a phone call on the car speaker. But we'll work out a better audio setup for future, I suppose, vlogs, right? So you can think of this as the first behind the scenes vlog for Mind, Brain and Behavior 1. I've got a lot of interesting stuff coming up. I know a lot of you are interested in what it's like to be a psychologist or to be an academic who's researching in psychology and teaching in psychology. I'm going all over the country at the moment for my big national research project, which is about stigma about severe mental illness and discrimination. And maybe I'll do some behind the scenes streams about that and some other bits of Mind, Brain and Behavior 1 as we go along. What do you think? Is that a good idea? Let me know in the comment section below if you think that's a good idea. And feel welcome to make any suggestions too for what sorts of behind the scenes vlogs we could do throughout the semester. All right, everyone, this is it. Here I am arriving at campus, going to park my car, and I'm going to see you all really soon. A couple of hours. Better finish off those slides, eh? All right, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye now.